This is Criteria.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Criteria. I'm Thomas Miras here with my co-host James Majewski. Hello, James.
Hello, Thomas. What's up?
And we're here for a fun episode today. We're going to be discussing some giants of screen comedy in the early sound era, coming off of the vaudeville stage, you know, back in the day when there would be this kind of a number of comedy artists, famous screen comedians, you know, came from vaudeville, like Buster Keaton and stuff. But he was, of course, more of a silent filmmaker, whereas these guys, namely the Marx Brothers, are squarely in the sound era. And we'll be discussing two of their films in particular. Duck Soup from 1933, directed by Leo McCarey, who is a Catholic director that I'm sure we will do at least a couple more episodes on because he made some really wonderful films. No, actually, we did discuss one of his films already, The Awful Truth.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. I forgot about that until just now. Yeah, so The Awful Truth, The Bells of St. Mary's, Going My Way, and Make Way for Tomorrow, really wonderful melodrama. And so now we're going to be discussing that one, which has a reputation of being his purely funniest film. And then we're going to be discussing a film that is more typical of kind of the Marx Brothers movie formula, which is A Night at the Opera from 1935, directed by Sam Wood. And we've got a great guest here today. We've been wanting to have him back on for a while, so we're very happy to have him on. What did he discuss with us previously? Wild Strawberries by Ingmar Bergman and La Strada by Federico Fellini. I think that's it. And he's back here to discuss the Marx Brothers, namely the poet and philosopher James Matthew Wilson, who runs the MFA program in creative writing at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, along with our friend Joshua Wren, who was recently on to discuss Wildcat with us. So happy to have James back on. Welcome back.
Thanks, Thomas. Thanks, James. Thanks for having me.
So it was your suggestion that we discuss the Marx Brothers. We were going back and forth. Is it going to be Whit Stillman? Is it going to be John Ford? Is it going to be the Marx Brothers? And finally settled on the Marx Brothers. So why is that?
Well, I didn't think I had to choose exclusively between those three. I'd love to revisit those other filmmakers with you down the road. But the Marx Brothers have a deep, they're in me deep. And I can't get them out. Among the great memories of my life, although one of them is a little bit sad in a way, one is going to England, going to the library and reading T.S. Eliot and Groucho Marx's letters together, or to one another, many years ago. And then a more painful memory was when I was doing the index to my book, The Vision of the Soul. Now, if there's any lesson that I can share with everybody, it's that if you can possibly avoid ever having to make your own index, by all means do it. I learned the hard way. I was doing an index for The Vision of the Soul, and it was Christmas time, and the children had just received the Blu-ray edition of the first 5 Marx Brothers films, the Paramount pictures that culminate in Duck Soup. And there they are, right after Christmas, downstairs laughing away, watching Duck Soup for the first time for them. And I was upstairs toiling miserably, trying to find how many times the word form appeared, and its different accentation.
Probably quite a lot.
Oh my gosh, yeah, it's like 60. And I have to say, that part of the index was kind of interesting, dividing form into ontological and aesthetic, but everything else was just pure misery. And I sat there listening to the kids laugh, and I said, I will never make another index again. For my next book, I paid to have the index done, or rather St. Thomas did.
Nice. All right. So, James, this was your first time seeing any Marx Brothers.
Yes. Yeah. So, obviously has been on the cinematic bucket list for a while.
Right.
And this is still, these will still have been the only 2 Marx Brothers films that I've seen. So I can't really speak to their position within the broader canon. But but yeah, it was interesting. Yeah.
What was your first impression, James? What stuck out?
Let's see, some first impressions. First off, I thought, wow, this is very sophisticated. I guess maybe it's film illiteracy, but sometimes you have the impression that older comedy is like somehow more simple, especially with the Marx Brothers, you get this picture of just like a bunch of slapstick. But actually, especially with Groucho, I was having a hard time keeping up. So it's very, very engaging. Another impression I had was there's just the sheer variety of what's on display. So, the vaudeville variety show comes to mind, but even within the Marx Brothers themselves, each of them has such a unique character and a sort of unique comedic style that he's bringing. I left sort of thinking, who's my favorite one, but it's hard to say because even if there's one that you find that you're responding to more, you have more like facility or more, you're responding to more effortlessly. There are others where, there's like, for instance, with Groucho, I found that he was kind of sticking with me. I was kind of, if with Harpo, I'm responding to him, in the moment. With Groucho, I'm like thinking about what he says after the movie has ended. And then maybe there's one more thing I can say by way of first impression, that I felt like I was, and now I'm no expert when it comes to comedy, but I did feel like I was seeing a through line from these guys to a lot of what I've laughed at in the comedy material that I've consumed, growing up. And I was thinking a lot about different like sketch comedy troupes that I've enjoyed in the past, and just was struck by how much similarity I could find in what are essentially like little sketches that appear in these films. They're films with an overarching story, but they're kind of a container for holding these little sketches throughout. And so, yeah, I mean, like as for SNL, for example, I'm no fan of SNL. I haven't watched a lot of SNL, but things analogous to SNL, things like SNL, I've seen plenty of. And I really feel like you can see a kind of through line, a kind of inheritance that goes back to what these guys are doing. So yeah, those are just some first impression thoughts that I've got.
Mm.
Yeah, trying to describe their humor it's not the easiest thing to do. On the one hand, I mean, there are some ways it's easy to describe. The Groucho's ability to just turn a sentence in an opposite direction and to render it absurd is great. And then Chico at his best, we get the misapprehensions, the mishearings. That's just your standard sanity clause. Ha ha ha! You no fool me. I know there's no Santa Claus. And that's all rooted in his his Italian persona, who neither speaks words quite rightly nor hears them quite rightly. But the language that people use to describe their comedy, anarchic and irreverent, etc., and none of it seems quite adequate, because I think the anarchic, and it has its association with the irreverent, as if it's tearing everything down, and they do tear things apart, but they tear things apart not out of just a mere lawlessness, but like really in defiance of intelligibility altogether. I mean, it's at the arithmetical level that they're tearing things apart. 2 plus 2 no longer equals 4. It you can't add anything up, and it's just, and so it ends up being the most unpredictable possible comedy, even when they're repeating the same bits over and over again, like Harpo resting his leg in your hand and asking you basically to hold up his leg so that he can find repose.
Yeah, well, Harpo is the silent one. We didn't talk about him yet. He's silent. He's got these kind of bulging eye expression that James reacted very strongly to as we were watching, and he's the agent of physical chaos in the film. I mean, they are all physical comedians. Groucho does all sorts of crazy little dances and funny ways of walking around with a walking stick and things like that. But Harpo is the most slapstick, the most physical comedian. But there's also kind of like a silent wit in the things that he does too. And what struck me, I think Duck Soup was the first one I ever saw. I've seen three or four of them. In Duck Soup, it's so purely like a series of sketches almost. Like it does have a plot, but much less. It attempts it much less than A Night at the Opera. A Night at the Opera is like a full hour-and-a-half movie. Duck Soup is about 65 minutes and feels kind of, other than like this sort of slow rev up at the beginning, it feels like just nonstop, chaos. And what strikes me is how these three characters kind of interact, because I mean, I haven't seen, I've never seen the Three Stooges, for instance, so I can't comment on how this would contrast with their approach. But what strikes me about the Marx Brothers, the three main ones, because there's also Zeppo in Duck Soup, and he is just the straight man, and he doesn't even seem like a Marx Brother, really, but he's part of the family, and he's in some of the movies. But what strikes me is how each of these are doing three different kinds of comedy. You know what I mean? And so they're able to clash with each other and cause chaos for each other, as well as all of the sort of regular characters out in the world. And that's very interesting in itself, and like how they work together and work against each other and do both at the same time. For instance, in the scene where they're in Duck Soup, where they're going in to get the plans, I think, if I remember correctly, and just causing chaos for everything the other is trying to do. So that's very interesting, because it's like they're speaking three different languages. And so if you want to talk about breaking things down, James, like these are three characters who are not even really commuting. I don't know that they really communicate with each other in any real way,
Yeah. I mean, the origin is, I think, Harpo with his blonde or red wig. He's often referred to as, in some places he's referred to as silent red. Sometimes you can see that the wig is red. Sometimes it's blonde for sure. But that he originates as sort of like a stage Irishman.
Okay.
Groucho with his walk, that's the only way you can really see it, emerges as a stage German.
Oh. But
it's only Chico who really specializes in being in Italian. He's always Ravelli or some other name like that. And he'll talk about being Italian, and you get the Italian at the end of everything, Flya, But the direction they take from there is completely different. So they're all supposed to be three different, ethnic groups, presumably with the Marx Brothers as, I think, French Jewish immigrants into New York, but that doesn't really last. All it does is create an occasion for them all to do something completely different. And as you say, Groucho has the most sort of verbal comedy to him. He's got the sharp double entendre and plays on words and sudden turns of phrase. Harpo has none of that. But he's not, I mean, maybe a comparison with the Three Stooges isn't that helpful, but, well, it is helpful in this respect. He does physical comedy, but it's not really slapstick most of the time. There are slapstick passages in the movies, but most of the time it's playing with his silence, and it's playing with, just what kind of absurd gesture can he do to break down the rules of communication that would normally obtain among people.
Yeah, Harpo, I found myself responding to the most because he's most obviously the clown, and he's doing these very classical clowning techniques with mime and kind of
honking horns.
Yeah, and the expressions and the kind of the whole character. This is an archetype that he's performing, and it works. It works so well. And one of the things that makes him even cooler is his name, like that he's also this musician, and so it's kind of amazing that he gets to have his cake and eat it too, in the sense that one moment he's totally chaotic, totally unpredictable, totally like idiotic. It's like he doesn't speak, and so he almost gives the impression of being like a kind of imbecile or something.
Right.
But then he starts to play the harp, and immediately there's this whole other side to him, this richness and depth and beauty and sophistication and poetry. And I just think it's such a brilliant juxtaposition, because not only is it like, delightful and funny in its own way, but it lingers after the music is finished and he goes back to being his chaotic, crazy self. That depth is still there in the background. We know what he's capable of. Mm-hmm. So I just think that it's very compelling.
Most of the time, that is for sure Harpo playing the harp and Chico playing the piano. That the hilarious way in which Chico learned how to use his fingers on the piano, which is itself a fantastic gag. That's the way they performed. And even if there were some things that were dubbed over, nonetheless, Harpo and Chico and Groucho, in the case of the guitar, were serious performers. And in fact, if I'm recalling correctly, Harpo recorded 2 albums on the harp, and it was, and they were distinctive because harps traditionally are secondary instruments within an orchestra. Rarely are they the sort of performing the melody rather than complementing the melody in music. But Harpo sort of pioneered the idea of using the harp as a lead instrument, the way in a rock band you would use a guitar, or in a symphony a violin.
And it definitely, all of their performances carry this very theatrical, vaudevillian, almost like something that you would see on the street. But I think Harpo most of all has this quality of being like, I could encounter you in the city plaza, with your hat out, for cash or something, doing all sorts of delightful feats.
Now, and Chico plays the piano, kind of like a trick piano, right? But Groucho, the only thing he does is sing, right? Does he play any instruments in any of the other films?
He plays the guitar, and
okay.
And in fact, in Horse Feathers, I think the single greatest of the Marx Brothers songs appear. Everyone Says I Love You, which is brilliantly written, and three of the brothers perform it. Zeppo performs a verse. Chico does a great verse where he gets to ham up, say Christopher Colombo in Italian, and talk about Christopher Columbus in an Italian accent. So it works out nicely. But one of the real triumphs is Groucho picking on his guitar, floating down a river with the college widow, singing this song to her, and it's
okay.
It's so great.
So when Groucho plays, is it in a comic mode still?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
So, but that's right. So that's kind of an interesting thing, because when they, there are songs in not all of the features, and Duck Soup is actually an exception here. There's less singing in Duck Soup, I think, than in any of the other movies.
Right.
But generally, the songs are comic. When Groucho's singing, it's comic. There will be serious songs that are sung in the films by the romantic subplot lead and his belle. But the only moments where you really see, in some sense, a kind of seriousness is with Harpo on the harp.
Yeah.
Chico's always kind of hamming around a little bit.
It's an instrument that's, I think, hard to make funny. And which isn't to say that he doesn't play it funnily at times, but it's sort of like in itself a very angelic and serious instrument, and so it changes the tone right away.
I think it's might be confusing things here, but I think it's in Day of the Races. He goes up to piano maybe that Chico has just played on, and starts playing it and plays it very harshly and smashes it up.
He does that in the Night of the Opera too. Before he gets on the harp, he plays these crazy clusters and does a sort of comedic piano performance.
Yeah, but I mean literally smashes it up. As in he smashes it up and he opens up the grand piano and pulls out a harp and then plays the harp. But it's meant to look as if it's the strings from the interior of the piano. And he
funny.
But so it's comic up to that moment, and then once he's on the harp, everything stops except for the melody.
And there's a moment in Duck Soup where I think he plays on the piano strings for a second as well. It's interesting. You mentioned the romantic subplot leads, and so I think Duck Soup is probably still my favorite of the ones I've seen, partially because it doesn't have that stuff. Like, I recognize that there's this Marx Brothers formula in it. There's like a little bit of something for everybody and stuff, but not all of it holds up as well. Like, some of the songs are kind of corny. The romantic song and even the singing style, in when the woman is leaving on the ship and singing to her guy in Night of the Opera, it's I found it a little bit like hard to to get through, but the comic songs are great. All the stuff that the Marx Brothers themselves are doing are great. So I don't know what you think about that, James, but as somebody who's watched a lot of these and watched them repeatedly, how does your family react to some of these non-comedic moments in the films?
Yeah, so the first film I showed my kids when they were old enough to remember, I had shown Horse Feathers to Livia when she was 2 or 3, and I thought, okay, this is too young. So I came back years later, and actually the kids were very resistant. What do you want to show us? We don't want to watch that. We want to watch Barbie or something like that. And
Barbie?
Well, not the new Barbie.
Okay,
Barbie's
gotcha.
And animated.
I see. Okay,
I forgot that there was the other thing. And we put on Coconuts, and the Coconuts, which is the first film that survives by them. And so you can break down the Marx Brothers films into different periods, but within the two main divisions, the films they made for Paramount and the films they made for other companies, especially MGM, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, of the early Paramount pictures, the first 2 were originally Broadway plays, The Coconuts and then Animal Crackers. And so when Coconuts it begins on a beach scene with a bunch of synchronized dancers, and I thought, I'm going to lose the kids right now. They're not going to tolerate that. By the end of that first dance number, Livia's saying, "This is the greatest movie." All the kids were into it. And what I think happened was that I thought they would be too impatient for it, but they seem to like the same thing for the most part. What I also like, which is what the variety you were describing. For some people, it's just too much. They're not interested in a musical. They're not interested in the performances. And for many people, they're definitely not interested in the subplots or the fact that the movie has a plot at all, about which there's more to be said. But for me, I like the earlier films the best, though I like them all. And the earlier films, there are 2 things that I really like about them. One was what you were describing, the way in which it's kind of sketchy, so that the film just stops rather than ends. I mean, yes, Duck Soup ends with a victory in a war, but that's really irrelevant to what's actually going on in the film. But I like the way in which they unfold like a stage show, where you have dancing, you have sincere music, and also comic music. You have different kinds of comedy, and then also in the earlier films, you get more of this than the later films. The writer's clearly not feeling much pressure to do more than the minimal effort in stringing these scenes together to make a whole.
Yeah.
Night of the Opera is the first. Sorry, real quick. Night of the Opera is the first movie where new writers are, or the writers are charged with making the movie make sense and to give it.
Well, one of the writers on Night of the Opera is George Kaufman, right? Who's a pretty well known serious playwright, right, or a comic player. I don't know much about his work.
Earlier films too for them.
Yeah, is Coconuts the one that's about real estate?
Yes.
Okay,
yep.
So I saw that pretty recently.
Yeah, I'm excited to introduce my children to the Marx Brothers now, having watched it. One thing that I have been able to turn my kids onto are the films of Jacques Tati. And I'm very, very proud of this because Tati is not, I think, like, easy necessarily.
It's pretty, like, slow and tranquil.
Yeah, but the kids are really into it. And actually their favorite is one of his later works. It might be his last film. And it's called Parade. And it's literally just a filmed version of a circus show that he produced and took on the road. And it's sort of the films, it has the least, apparent plot because it's just a circus show. But it really leans into the variety and all of the different stuff that he's able to do with this totally free-form format. So I just mentioned that because I think it's interesting. The kids seem to respond to that the most. They're happy to move from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, without necessarily needing this like through line to keep their attention.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I'm excited about showing the Marx Brothers to my boys because in a way they've actually helped me to appreciate Tati more because I see the way that they're responding to it and the things that they are finding enjoyable. And I think that probably a similar dynamic might emerge if I were to watch the Marx Brothers with them.
Yeah. It's interesting. It's something in Tati that's almost like a children's book where you can pick out new details each time. You could say like a Where's Waldo, but also like a Richard Scarry kind of situation.
Definitely. Yeah, we should definitely talk about a Tati film sometime on the podcast. But, it also, speaking of detecting a through line, something that also comes to mind, and this is in part because Thomas mentioned it when we were watching it together, is the Muppets. And these guys, I think Thomas said, they're basically walking Muppets, and that, in
relation to the real human beings, in the rest of the cast.
So, if you think about it in that way, my experience of the Muppets too as a child was so much like, sometimes having difficulty with some of the slower song numbers, some of the stuff that maybe was not as upbeat or obviously comedic. But actually, when I reflect on that, there's a lot of heart in those sequences, and I remember that fondly, such that I would miss it now. So for instance, in A Muppet's Christmas Carol, they've totally excised a song where young Scrooge and young Belle, is that her name, Belle? I forget. Their relationship ends. It's like the breakup sequence. And so if you watch that nowadays in the version that
they've excised it as in it was in there, and then
it was in there and it is no longer. And it's presumably because this was too slow, not emotionally charged, not interesting to the children. But I bring that up as an example because it's actually precisely that I kind of remember being something that stuck with me as a child, that somehow resonated, even if in the moment I wasn't kind of responding it to a way that I fully understood or appreciated. And so I think that maybe there's something similar that could be said here, that, it's good too for the heart of a film, for like the beating heart of a film to contain some of this stuff, even if it's not as immediately satisfying,
Yeah. The comparison between the Marx Brothers and the Muppets is one I've heard before, and I think it's a really just one. Aside from the fact that the Muppets is a vaudeville style theater, and so it's a vaudeville style variety show, so I guess it goes without saying that there's a certain similarity. But you just the sort of eruptions of absurdity in the Muppets are, the great precedent is what the Marx Brothers are doing. And of course, the other point of comparison that is also to non-human things is the Looney Tunes, the Bugs Bunny.
Yeah,
right.
Who's kind of based partially on Groucho, I think.
Yes, yeah. I mean, directly. I mean, I think there are Looney Tunes with Marx Brothers caricatures, and in fact, let's go down even farther into ridiculousness. I remember when Livia was 2 or 3, her watching the Elmo show that was part of Sesame Street. I don't know if it still is, but and they have a cartoon parrot who squawks out, "Hail Fredonia!" And I just thought, this is that.
Yeah.
I remember watching that and that really speaking to me, because I thought just that little allusion suggests the way in which the Marx Brothers have percolated their way through so much of our understanding of what comedy is. And that the allusion to it is a sign of, we actually participate in a kind of patrimony of this kind of humor. It's not just, it functions the way most literary allusions do, and that is to draw you into a tradition and to recognize you're part of it. Yeah.
So our friend Nathan, he disagrees with me about Duck Soup because he thinks it's kind of just a mess, like as a film, But I'm watching the Marx Brothers because it's funny, and so the more funny it is, the more happy I am, But on my second watching of A Night of the Opera, I did appreciate the kind of the greater orderliness of the structure of it, and also a thing that I appreciated on second viewing is that it's able to kind of settle into some of these longer, more elaborate bits, like the whole contract conversation between Groucho and Chico, for instance. There's a number of kind of longer bits that are able to be drawn out where it starts to feel less chaotic and more like the sketch comedy that we recognize today. Like this is like a full sketch, not just like a one-liner or like a crazy chaotic split second, So I appreciated that, and that's true of some of the other longer ones I've seen as well. Another thing I wanted to bring about the differences between these characters is, I mean, if we're going to compare them to Muppets versus humans, there's also like a sort of like a class element too, because Groucho is the one who's kind of like on the inside of society. Now, like at heart, he's really with the other two, right? Because he is an agent of chaos himself, but somehow he's this guy who's managed to like get in. So in Duck Soup, he is the head of state, and in A Night of the Opera, he is an agent, a manager of
a company.
Yeah. So and in both cases, it's because of he's able to attach himself to, what's the actress's name? The Margaret Dumont character. In both cases, it's because he has some kind of charm over her or something. And it's kind of inexplicable because she's this totally like humorless, like kind of society woman. And he's able to just like flatter her into keeping him around. And it's just hilarious. And it's really essential to these films, I think, especially to Groucho's character, because he has to have like a normal person as a foil. But she looks like she has never gotten one of his jokes ever, but her presence adds a lot. But then Chico and Harpo are these kind of outsider characters, and Chico with the kind of the ethnic thing, and Harpo just with the like the imbecile thing. But what I like is that they get drawn in, and there's this sort of collaboration, say in Duck Soup, where Chico and Harpo are playing spies who are supposed to be spying on Groucho, right? And yet they almost immediately enter into this kind of partnership where they sort of recognize like kindred, like scam artist spirits, which is part of what makes it so delightful. Is like the plot thing doesn't matter as soon as they sort of like they connect and they realize they have this like weird conflicting chemistry, everything else kind of goes out the window.
Yes. Yeah. The best single scene in Duck Soup, I think, is when we first meet Chico and Harpo when they come as spies to the ambassador, the villain ambassador's office, and we've learned that they've been appointed to survey, to spy on Groucho. Actually, let me read this passage from the Conium book. This is Ciccolini, so Chico, explaining to the ambassador their great success in spying on Firefly. Monday we watch Firefly's house, but he no come out. He wasn't home. Tuesday we go to the ball game, but he fool us. He no show up. Wednesday he go to the ball game, and we fool him. We no show up. Thursday was a doubleheader. Nobody show up. Friday it rained all day. There was no ball game, so we stayed home and listened to it over the radio. It's just, it's just so good.
Yeah.
You know, he gives the ambassador a good quarter cigar. I smoke the other 3 quarters. And as soon as the ambassador turns around, Harpo just pulls out a giant pair of scissors and cuts off the tails on his tailcoat, and then eventually applies glue to his rear end so that the scene inexplicably fades out just as you get a glimpse of that he has now sat on a newspaper, so has a newspaper glued to his rear end. But you hardly even see it long enough to appreciate it because they cut the camera too soon.
Yeah. There's like almost a comedy of frustration in this movie. Like anytime anything tries to go somewhere, that like, it's like you said, it breaks down the logic of everything at every moment. So anytime something is going somewhere, it gets frustrated. And I think that the hardest I've probably ever laughed watching a movie is the scene with Harpo just tormenting this poor vendor.
Yeah.
And it's really funny. It's also kind of mean. But what made me react so viscerally to it the first time I saw it is that it just doesn't let up. And you're feeling like the anxiety and like the nervousness of the guy who's receiving the torment as well. And so like it produced this like nervous, hysterical laughter in me just watching this poor guy because it just doesn't let up. It's one thing after another, and it's just complete chaos, and frustration is like the best way that I can describe it. It's like this beautiful frustration that is produced.
Yes. Yeah. The sleight of hand trick, exchanging hats, which appears in several movies. And so the guy just cannot get his bowler hat back. He keeps ending up with either Chico's hat or Harpo's, because Harpo will put his hand up on the guy's head just as he's about to put his hat on and pull it off and put another hat on. But then of course, so this just ramps up and becomes more and more frustrating for the guy, and he gets exasperated. And then finally it ends not with some resolution, but just with Harpo simply taking his hat and putting it on the burner in the roasted peanuts stand and just watching it go, and then going and just saying, look what I did, boss. You know, like he's just totally content to share this experience with the guy whose hat he is now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Or when he stomps his bare feet into the lemonade or blue water or whatever the guy is selling.
Lemonade, yeah. That was that scene. I was just rewatching that with the kids last week, and John Cassian, who's 6, he's really been along for the ride with the Marx Brothers since he was born, because I started showing the kids Marx Brothers about a year before he was born, 2 years before he was born. And so the other night in that scene, he was completely in hysterics. I've never seen him laugh as hard as he did at the vendor scenes, or 2 scenes in the Marx Brothers. He was out of control.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
One of the things that I liked about Groucho is, he's so smart. His comedy is so smart, or at least it makes you feel dumb when you can't keep up with it and you're trying to like untangle the wordplay. And as soon as you've understood what one joke, he's already moved on to the next one. One of the things that he gives this impression of, at least for me, was that there's some meaning here, that there's something being said that I'm not privy to, that, in the same way that he's kind of turning things around on the other characters that he's speaking with, and sometimes kind of, offering these like veiled insults that they don't totally get. I'm left feeling like there's some message here. There's some satire or criticism or comment that I'm meant to see, but I can't. Now, not having had any experience with the Marx Brothers before this, I wanted to ask you, James, whether you think there is anything there, or if this is just an illusion, like so much else.
Yeah, if I had to give a one-word answer, illusion would be it. But this raises an interesting aspect of the Marx Brothers legacy and how they've been viewed, because in the 1960s they were thought of as having this kind of social satirical role. So Duck Soup was interpreted as an anti-war film, and who knows what the rest of it was, but it was supposed to be part of the counterculture. And apparently the Marx Brothers were aware that this was a good way to get rich and to renew their reputations, so they didn't discourage these interpretations. But I think it's just for the pure joy of showing the way in which words break off in different directions. You know, when in the Coconuts, I know that's not one of the movies we're talking about, but in one of the first long exchanges between Chico and Groucho, of which the contract scene in Night at the Opera is the last in all of their movies, but first one, Groucho's trying to explain to Chico how he has to bid up at an auction, a real estate auction, to raise the prices, which Chico's going to do. He's going to keep bidding outbid everybody, which is not the purpose of it, that he was assigned. And so Groucho's showing him the real estate map of all of these homes in Florida that are to be auctioned off in a new development, and Coconut Manor, and he says, over here are the levees, meaning, you know, the waterways, and Chico goes, it's the Jewish neighborhood. And just the way in which they're so attentive to the way in which words break off like forks in the road, and that you can just take those directions. I absolutely adore it. I think it really reminds me of what wit does in every work of art, and, you know, being a poet, I'm thinking about poetry in particular, but the way in which the classic definition of wit, which strangely enough comes to us from Thomas Hobbes, who's not usually thought of as a classic of anything, but is the idea of being able to take two things that superficially look disparate and are literally different, but to perceive a similarity or an identity within them. And that way of taking things that actually literally don't make sense, but then to make sense out of them by joining them at some figurative level, that just seems to me at the heart of their humor. But that's also like at the heart of what all great art does. Not to go on too deep in this, but for Aristotle, on the idea of plot, the way a plot works, when it works well, is that it unfolds in a perfectly logical sequence, but you cannot see the logic of the sequence until the moment of reversal, when there's a sudden turn that was totally unexpected, and that begets a recognition, an epiphany, where you look back and suddenly what seemed like just an unfolding sequence of events that didn't make any sense together, suddenly it all makes sense together. You say, oh, that's where this is headed. And the best comedy works that way too. And what the Marx Brothers have figured out a way to do is to actually have a reversal and a recognition, sometimes as quick as every 10 seconds. A new word just branching off in a different direction of meaning that you didn't anticipate it taking.
Yeah, that's great. I think that, you know, watching, say, something like Duck Soup, where, you know, it's about, well, you know, in some ways it was interesting watching it now, because of course in the United States at the time of this recording, we're like a couple of weeks into a new presidential administration, and so I was finding a lot of like resonances between what's happening in Duck Soup with the beginning of this new administration, this new Groucho is, I don't know if he's called the president or what, but he's the leader of Fredonia. and he's making all of these changes and he's shaking things up. But I kind of appreciated that there was like a distinct lack of any sort of like on the nose political commentary. Certainly, especially if you consider other works like, say, Charlie Chaplin, where, in his films, it's like much more apparent like what the social comment is. Sometimes he even just like straight up tells you, but I like that there's this, there's like room for the film to breathe so that anybody on any like end of any political spectrum could watch this and laugh at it, and maybe they're not walking away with like some point that you were trying to make, but still a point is made. Do you know what I mean? Like there's something kind of like primitive and essential and fundamental about like the absurdity of governance, and governing structures that's expressed, So yeah, I liked that.
Yeah. Matthew Coniam in the annotated Marx Brothers talks about in Duck Soup that in 1933 there were a bunch of films, American films, all positive, made about the rise of fascism, and it was because fascism at that moment was simply identified with a strong government that could, reverse economic malaise. And so, according to him, at this time, even Roosevelt is thought to be, with the advent of the New Deal, is thought to be making taking the best elements, as they would say, of fascism without the crudity or something like that. And so it's definitely the case that Firefly getting appointed, over this sort of Weimar incompetent Fredonia does have resonances with the period, but just as the word fascism is sort of multivalent at that moment, it doesn't necessarily mean anything bad in most people's minds. So too, Duck Soup is totally indeterminate.
Yeah, I agree.
The only thing we know for sure is that Sylvania wants to conquer Fredonia, and we don't want that to happen. And but why? Because just because the Marx Brothers are in Fredonia, even though half of them are on the side of Sylvania as secret agents. So
it's pretty funny how Groucho will not allow the ambassador Trentino to make up with him. Like I wish I could remember exactly what he does in the last scene where it's finally definitive it's going to be war, but he just finds a way to insult people gratuitously, and you never quite know why it is, other than just for the joy of
he works
game.
himself up. He starts like exploring a hypothetical.
Oh, that's right.
Mind.
Yeah.
Well,
he's like, if I accept him, I'll look like a fool, and like blah 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 blah. And then suddenly, when the guy walks in, he's so worked up that he just immediately slaps him. What? No, he says like, what if I, no, yeah, he's like, what if I extend my hand to him and he doesn't shake my hand, then I'll look like a fool. And he's like, and then he comes and he says, you dare to refuse my handshake? It's hilarious. And of course we do that, it's pretty funny.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Usually lying in bed at night, what did that person do? And, but he does it right in front of us and in front of Mrs. Teasdale, Margaret Dumont. Yeah. And then he has the good or ill luck of getting to immediately confront the man who only hypothetically has insulted him. So good. Yeah. Yeah.
My favorite line that I came away with is from the beginning of Night at the Opera, when he has been sitting with this other girl and he stood Mrs. Whatever her name is in that movie, Margaret Dumont's character, up for a date. And he says, I sit with her because she reminds me of you. That's such a great line.
Gotta remember that one.
Her eyes remind me of you. Her lips remind me of you. Everything about her reminds me of you, except you.
Right. Yeah.
Everything reminds me of you except you. Yep.
Yeah.
Now, James, I understand that there's another reason why you're a good person for us to talk to about the Marx Brothers, and that's because you've worked the Marx Brothers into some of your poetry, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So I think in a first for the Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, could we perhaps ask that you read this poem on the episode?
Absolutely, yeah. And it'll, given the tenor of our conversation, and we've talked about our kids' reactions or potential reactions to this will be appropriate. Well, I'll say a couple words about it at the end. I'll just read it. This is from the Quarantine Notebook, the long poem in the strangeness of the good that unfolds like a diary or really journalism in blank verse, in iambic pentameter verse, across the first couple of months of the pandemic. And so April 1st, 2020, which is April Fool's Day, and is also my wedding anniversary, this poem will refer to the Marx Brothers. So it's April 1st, 2020, and it's for my wife, Hillary. The rising light of early morning falls on kitchen table, tucked in chairs, and finds at last the open floor's dark paneled wood. There, 15 months old now, John Cassian stands, smiling and naked save his new changed diaper. He takes 3 gambling steps before the fridge, then lowers down in fear of his own powers. This walking is all new to him. I think that he is of you, and you're here with me, though also upstairs catching one last hour of sleep within the heavy curtained dark. That is one gift for you, this final hour, to start our 14th anniversary. My brother's called to say he's got the virus, electric cables jolting through his blood, and fever sweat anoints him with its crown. He lies in bed and thinks of the Pacific, 2 miles away, as if it were the start of boundless freedom and of paradise. When we hang up, I scan the morning paper, and find each headline bellows out its number, the count of dying dead or newly ill, of unemployed who wait for promised checks, or homeless in Las Vegas, left to squat in painted hopscotch squares upon the tarmac until the shelter can reopen. What of this will we discuss at morning coffee? What will we do behind our bolted doors to mark the depths to which this day transformed us? The children watched Duck Soup the other night, the 100th time or so we put it on. What starts in pageant and diplomacy soon veers with Harpo's motorbike to chaos, descends by an incessant squeak of horns, and through a trial as fake as those in Lear, lands sprawling finally on a battlefield. And there, within a humbled, bombed-out shack, Groucho's long wayward quest for Margaret Dumont reaches some kind of end. In such a place, where fate not only brings 2 loves together, but guarantees that Groucho can't escape. How grateful he must be for tanks and shells to keep them both holed up, even though his mouth may rat-tat like a wild Tommy gun, undoing pleas of love with sudden wisecracks. There is no getting out of her great arms. Am I, like him, a sharp-tongued unromantic? Or do you see behind the fake mustache and lit cigar, eyes roll with adoration? The hour does not lend itself to slapstick. One friend with his black sense of humor notes that if the virus doesn't get us, well, the Yellowstone volcano probably will, or more tornadoes charging up from Jonesboro, and failing that, an asteroid is due to brush by Earth the final days of April. He doesn't plan to stick around to see it. Under the circumstance, it's no surprise the news reports a case of tragic love, a husband and his wife afraid to die, hide in their home and watch the president on television, mumbling on like Chico about the promises of chloroquine. They find some on the shelf or something like it, and though it's labeled poison, don't ingest, they mix it with their Pepsi. In an hour the husband's dead, the wife in hospital. The darkness would snuff out our morning light. A friend in Colorado also writes me, explaining his long silence with a story. A month ago, his wife ran off the road and could remember nothing of it after. Her back now broken, staring at the lights above her bed, she listens as the doctors inform her husband that her neck and brain are riddled with small cancerous growths. And now, the hospital sealed off with quarantine. Her husband drives her there each week, then waits. She disappears within. An hour goes by. The doctors fight her death in short, quick bursts. And then she's pushed back out, and they drive home, her body drifting with the car through daylight. What does her husband feel again beside her? One more punctilious duty in a life they've shared and go on sharing as they may. The rhythm of their marriage troubled, yes, but carrying on, one treatment at a time. Or is it something more? This friend of mine, who's always had a streak of Groucho in him, to meet the darkness with a snappy word, does he now feel the oceanic weight of love? The kind that lifts you up and pulls you out and drags you deep into the tide and says, from now on, think of nothing else, but that you cannot bear to lose this one you love. Feel your ambitions drop away, your defects and your failings too, and give the little that is left to try to save her, and hope for nothing but that she will live. I stand there in the kitchen, where I started, shaken by what comes calling from afar, the halting, stumbling steps of doubtful futures, and think there is no gift that's adequate to greet you at your waking on this day.
Dude, thank you. Wow.
Good stuff. Good stuff.
That was the first poem that Hillary ever said that was worthy of her. I've tried.
Not bad. Not bad. Yeah, that's cool too, because it took me back to that April, because I remember what I was up to. Our first son was born, just on April 13th, just 2 weeks later. So
yes.
It was like a very fraught, charged time. Mm-hmm. But yeah, man, that's good stuff. Yeah. So talk to us about it.
Well, the one thing that has to be noted, and because I got to tell your public about, some details about the Marx Brothers movies, is that, the first 5 Marx Brothers movies, from The Coconuts through Duck Soup, those feature the 4 Marx Brothers. Zeppo's in there. And then he leaves the act after Duck Soup. And so when A Night at the Opera unfolds, Alan Jones, who's the subplot protagonist, looks a little bit like Zeppo.
Right.
But he's not really Zeppo's replacement. There's no replacement for Zeppo. And Zeppo hardly needed a replacement because most of the time, like Margaret Dumont, he just played sort of a straight man for his brother's jokes. But my poem talks about Duck Soup, so I wanted Zeppo in there, and I wrote in a subsequent draft, I think 4 lines that got Zeppo in there. And my wife, she said, no, those aren't convincing. So Zeppo once again was shafted and killed out of the act. just even when he deserves to be there. But yeah, and it was really remarkable. I mean, the Quarantine Notebook poems I was trying to write the news in pentameter verse, and I wanted we're only 4 years out from that, or 5 years soon to be. I wanted 50 years from now, if people were still alive, who lived through that experience, to be able to read the poem and say, yeah, this is actually pretty accurate to how it was. A lot of there were a lot of poets who tried to cash in on the quarantine. There was a whole anthology of poems about, poems about the coronavirus or the quarantine period, the pandemic period, and some individual poets also published collections similar to, in this respect, at least to mine. I have this long 50-page poem about it. My sense of most of the poems I've seen from that period is they're pretty shrill, ballads about why aren't you masking or something like that. And I just thought, oh, how awful that would be. Who wants to revisit that? And I wanted to capture sort of the fullness of the body of the experience, and and especially because there's so much darkness, but there were so many kind of interesting or strange things that happen to people, especially when you have a big family like mine, relatively big family anyhow. When you've got 7 people all together and you suddenly have a lot more time on your hands, there's more time for Marx Brothers.
Yeah,
we watched a lot of Marx Brothers that were celebrating it.
Right. Yeah. It was an amazing time to have a first child, because It was like, time completely stood still, mm-hmm. and we weren't going anywhere anyway. You know what I mean? Like, we didn't want to go anywhere. We wanted to just be at home with our boy. So it was really incredible. And, but, oh man, I totally relate to how your description of Groucho, because my wife would totally relate to that. I don't know that Groucho is, so bent out of shape about how he comes across. You know, I don't know that there's necessarily like a deeper love and admiration that's struggling to get through. But it's a great image for
his professions of love for Margaret Dumont seem to be as gratuitous as his insults.
Yeah, right.
It's like it's just another way to get a reaction or something. I'm not sure what's going on there, but it's just funny. It's because it's funny, and so he does it, you know.
Yeah. But it's a great image for the masks that we wear to disguise our vulnerability, even with the people that we're closest to. You know, or at least that's how I took it.
And in Groucho, especially the movies like Duck Soup, where Groucho never, he really only shows one, you might say two sides to his personality: the wisecracking, fast talking, pun making fraud, and then for seconds at a time, I love you. Can't you see that I love you? And then, but that's going to be finished with an insult. And I can see they're going to tear you down and put up an office building where you're standing. And but the only moment in the early films where you see the slightest bit of some other more sincere feeling is the roll of the eyes, which of course is totally fraudulent too. But it's where it suggests that there could be another side. In Night at the Opera, this is he gets fired. Margaret Dumont supports his firing, and he's kicked down the stairs, and he's humiliated, and that happens a couple times. I mean, usually he acquits himself well when he's humiliated, like in Last Night at the Opera is the great stateroom scene where he's on top of the world and literally on top of his gigantic trunk being chauffeured by the steward to his stateroom, and they open up the door and it turns out it's basically a closet with some pipes sticking out of the wall, and then he and 30 people eventually crowd into it before exploding out of it when Margaret Dumont opens the door, and that's just one too many people. He gets a little bit, he becomes, this was actually intentional with that movie, was to try to make the Marx Brothers a little bit more sympathetic, so they were clearly on the side of the good, rather than being very ambiguous as to whether there's any moral valence to them at all.
Because they're helping the young couple.
They're helping the young couple. Yep. And as Kandian puts it in his book, they're also helping opera, because Laspari is not as good a singer as Borroni. And so by getting Borroni to sing Il Trovatore, by their connivances and their cunning, they are in fact the great defenders of the art form, they're not merely irreverent towards the opera. Although Otis Driftwood, Groucho, clearly doesn't like it.
And going back to your poem, James, was there a reason that you wanted to work the Marx Brothers into this poem to your wife, beyond just its kind of relevance to this experience of quarantine and what was happening in your home?
Yeah, that's a question related to the one you asked earlier about is there a sort of sense to all of this in Duck Soup? But I said in Duck Soup, maybe there's no sort of secret thematic method to the madness of Groucho's comedy, but one of the main ambitions of the Quarantine Notebook poem was, if it's a poem in verse and iambic pentameter, as I've said, this is my third time saying that, but it doesn't rhyme. There are a couple end rhymes over the course of the 1,000 lines or so, but 2,000 lines maybe, but it's, for the most part, it's blank. It's unrhymed and metrical verse. And when I started out the poem, I said, what I want to do is capture conceptual rhymes. That is to say, to show the way the different public events that were unfolding in 2020, the way the very different personal domestic events in our house were unfolding, and then also the way in which things were unfolding in other people's lives, equally private as my family is, private people, not as opposed to politicians or something like that, but the way in which all of our lives were rhyming, and the way in which things in the headlines that were of international significance often would find their significance in our domestic situation, and in the lives of others. As I've I've had occasion to say this about that poem and that period, is that in 2020, Americans never had more in common. Our lives were never more alike than in the first couple months of the pandemic, and yet we were never further apart. Not just physically, but of course this was not the beginning of, but it's a sort of climax to the kind of spine-breaking social breakdown of divisiveness that's stayed with us, really pretty much ever since, until the last few months maybe. And so I wanted for people who really think they have so little in common that they hate each other and dehumanize each other, I wanted to show the way in which actually our lives were rhyming with one another. And I have to say just one last point on that. So I won't mention it by name, but the account I give here of a friend of mine who lost his wife during the pandemic, and they had to go to the cancer treatments while these hospitals were virtually locked down, etc. That story was so painful and sad to hear. It was just awful to hear it in those days, and yet here I was thinking about the Marx Brothers, thinking about my own anniversary with my wife, and I think this guy is a Jewish poet who is always a total wit and always coming up with a one-liner. I thought, oh my gosh, this guy's Groucho, and just to see the way in which all of these things that actually happened were speaking to each other or resonating with one another, echoing, rhyming with each other. That was actually, in my view, the most important thing I could do, was to sort of to bring form to the apparently meaningless chronology of this time unfolding, to show that actually the minutes and the hours formed a whole bigger than the sum of their parts.
That's great. I think that, this might sound a little forced, like a little contrived, like I'm trying to tie this into our discussion of the Marx Brothers, but I actually think that that's probably not a bad way to watch the Marx Brothers, to like look for those little rhymes that, and aren't necessarily bound up in like some overarching thematic comment that they're making, but that nevertheless, have significance. I mean, that definitely has been my experience of watching Duck Soup with all of this new administration stuff going on in the news, and I guess one last thing before we wrap this up. You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation these letters between T.S. Eliot and Groucho Marx. Could you, this is the first I'm hearing about that, could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, yeah. So sometime in the 50s, Groucho came to London and they dined together. And it was a bit of a disaster. Groucho, who had pretty serious literary ambitions, actually, and his he published several books, including some of his letters to his daughter and to, I think, other family members as well. He seems to have spent the period leading up to their dinner, brushing up on his Hamlet and his Wasteland. And Eliot, who loved comedy, and in fact, well, let me end that sentence. Eliot loved comedy. Eliot was outside the United States permanently by the time the Marx Brothers were even on the stage, or right around the time they actually went on the stage for the first time in vaudeville. But Eliot was a regular attender of the London equivalent of vaudeville performances, which were the music hall performances, and he loved them. And in fact, one of the few really genuinely heartwarming but also grim essays he writes is a tribute to Marie Lloyd, the music hall singer and actress, after her death, it's just a tribute to her, but also makes some really profound claims about the future of modern civilization that bear reading, including predicting that people will have robots reciting bedtime stories to their children in their cribs. So,
wow.
Or mechanical voices, anyhow. But anyhow, so Eliot loved comedy, and he did have a pretty good sense of humor, which comes out, I think, at its best in the Old Possum's book of Practical Cats.
Sure.
That's a very that has a Marx Brothers spirit to it. That those poems are really superb. His other attempts at being comic are not as great. His King Bolo poems, which are usually getting attacked because they're racist or misogynist, which is,
of course.
But I mean, comedy is racist and misogynist.
Yeah.
Comedy takes no hostages; it kills everything, and that's the delight, is to watch its particular kind of murder. So that doesn't make any difference. But it's just not. They're not that funny. You can see that he's trying to be obscene and to amuse Ezra Pound and Wyndham Lewis, and he's probably succeeding, but it doesn't really carry across the decades too well. But he loved humor, and I think he wanted to be funnier than he was. And so he also was very anxious about this dinner, and apparently, according to Lyndall Gordon, the dinner was not a success. But then they struck up a correspondence afterwards, and the correspondence takes place with them at their ease, and so they set about amusing each other for, I don't remember how long the book is, but it is a book-length collection of letters.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. I'll have to check that out sometime. Cool.
That's the two things that, actually, I'll say the three things just because this will be interesting to some of your listeners that I've never gotten around to researching, but I always envisioned I would write something about, was one, go into more depth on Eliot and Groucho. Two, to actually talk about Tolkien, because evidently Tolkien considered the Marx Brothers his favorite comedians.
Oh, I never heard that.
I've only heard that once, so I'd be curious, and I don't even remember where I heard it. So I'd be curious to hear if that's something we could confirm.
Interesting.
And then just while we're at it, another Englishman who actually had a bit of a Marx Brothers sense of humor is W.H. Auden, and I'd love someday to. Auden, of course, studied under Tolkien at Oxford and was very influenced by him. But to trace out all of the influence of Auden and Tolkien, both Tolkien on Auden, but also Auden reviewed all of the Lord of the Rings as it was originally appearing.
He wrote some of the most glowing reviews of Lord of the Rings, right?
Yes, and gave a lecture that upset Tolkien very much because the lecture made it seem as if Auden knew Tolkien more intimately than he did, analyzing his personality, etc. And Tolkien didn't care for that too much. But
sure, yeah.
But there was a lot of just sort of interesting, fruitful exchange between Tolkien, Auden, and then I know this is very tangential to the Marx Brothers, but I see it as just this moment where popular culture, including Tolkien as the great popular novelist and the art of poetry, sort of converged at these different moments.
Very interesting. Well, I'm glad that you suggested that we discuss the Marx Brothers, and there's a good conversation. I'm glad that we picked these two films in particular. I think that I would still probably recommend Duck Soup as an entry point because it's a shorter film. It's only about an hour long, so it doesn't really ask much of you. So if you've not watched any Marx Brothers, I think it's a great jumping off point. And then if you find that you get a kick out of it, even if just a little bit, then maybe exploring some of the other things that you can hang your hat on a little bit more.
Yeah, Horse Feathers is really good too. That's one of the best ones that I've seen.
Yes. Yeah, I think that the choice that you have, and this is why we picked Duck Soup and Night at the Opera, is that Duck Soup is the last of the Paramount movies, and Night at the Opera begins the MGM and RKO films. And those later films are much more deliberately cinematic. They have plot arcs. Everything makes sense and resolves, and that's very intentional. Whereas the early films are almost like stage shows. Two of them originated as stage shows, and they're not at all concerned about tying up loose ends. They're happy just to stop and go on to the next thing. And I think for a lot of people, that's the great joy of the Marx Brothers, because because you're sensing that things are just going to keep breaking apart. And when the plot itself begins to sort of break apart or go sideways, and clearly the writers are not concerned with tying things up neatly, that just feels like a more genuinely Marxian experience, I think.
Okay, I'll ask one more question then, because these films do have writers. So how much are the Marx Brothers then contributing to the dialogue and stuff like that? Or are the writers more just for the story?
Yeah. And, there are so many moments where it just seems as if the Marx Brothers must be their own writers, like the contract scene you mentioned in A Night at the Opera, which was something they performed on stage. And it just... And there are even pauses. There's the scene unfolds more slowly. And it's one of several that do that, especially in the early movies, where you think it's unfolding slowly, simply to give Groucho a chance to think up his next line. And sometimes there'll even be silence in Animal Crackers. There is silence where he's sitting there with his cigar for a second, and you think he's thinking, but in fact they went through multiple drafts. Things in the case of The Night at the Opera, they performed most of the movie on a road tour on stage, basically to try out different bits before audiences to see what got the laughs. And they wrote and rewrote, and their writers were writing and rewriting. And so while I'm sure the Marx Brothers did a lot of ad hoc things that led to the revisions in the script, they did have writers, which kind of shocked me when I first learned it, because it seemed like Groucho. Oh, who could write Groucho except Groucho?
Right.
Right.
People wrote for them and wrote very well for them.
Yeah.
Interesting. All right. Well, great. Well, James, thank you for coming on and for reading your poem.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, guys. Great to see you.
All right. Well, I think next time we are getting back to our Terrence Malick series, and we're going to be discussing, what's it called?
Voyage of Time?
Voyage of Time, yeah. One of his lesser-known films, documentary that came out of the making of The Tree of Life. There's a short version narrated by Brad Pitt, I think, and there's a long version narrated by
Cate Blanchett.
Yeah, so we'll be discussing that with Nathan Douglas in our next episode, and that'll be, I don't know if that'll come out in early Lent or something like that. But okay, well, thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Jim Papandrea, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.